Hello Santa Fe, I'm Carlene and welcome to Living Santa Fe. And happy President's Day to our guest.
Thank you.
Benedicte Valentiner.
Valentiner, okay.
Benedicte, you came to this country when?
I came here in 1963, and I came as an immigrant. My father was stationed as the Danish naval attaché in United States and Canada. And I had just been mucking around Europe and Cyprus. I lived in several places, training in hotel business. So when he told me that instead of staying in Denmark, when I finally arrived back to my own country, he told me he was so happy I was going to be with them, but it would only be for 9 months because they had been stationed to Washington. And of course the roof fell off, and I howled and I screamed and I danced up and down, and nothing could have been more wonderful. So in order for me to work for the American hotel business, which was my love and passion, I was lucky enough to get an immigration visa from the embassy, and I have never looked back. It was the biggest and best decision I made in my life. And I came here in '63, a month after my parents, and after a few months got a dream job at the Shoreham Hotel in Washington, D.C. as assistant to the international director of sales. And that was absolutely unbelievable, because it was back in the time we were here the last 6 months of President Kennedy, and he had introduced with the senator from state of Washington the Visit USA program. And because the dollar was so strong, it was flowing out of the country, and they needed to sort of get it back again. So they offered everybody in the tourist industry, hotels, bus lines, airlines, and so on, they got them on board and they offered them lower rates so that tourists could come to America. And that was what sort of started my, how can I say, my lovely hotel career until I married. And then I went with my ex-husband, my dear friend, who was in the Lieutenant Colonel in the U.S. Army. We were stationed at Fort Bliss, Texas. Can you imagine a city-born girl being dragged across Texas, kicking and screaming? But it was again another of these marvelous open doors in one's life, where the desert was wonderful, people were lovely, the pace was slightly slower, so you had time to think about stuff. And it was just lovely. And I worked there for a couple of years at the Sheraton first, and then the Hilton Hotel, introducing me to chain hotel atmosphere in the country. It was all sort of falling in place. Then when Kent retired, he always wanted to return to Iran. He was an expert in Iran from the US Army through a program that doesn't exist anymore, where young American officers befriend young upcoming leaders in the country, live there in some city and go to university and so on. Anyway, we came out to Iran, and I lived for 2 years off and on in a Volkswagen bus. Can't you tell? You know, I'm the type for Volkswagen bus.
I think you're the type for anything.
And we did raptor research. My ex-husband is a falconer, and so we hunts with falcons, and he always wanted to do raptor research in Iran, and it was a very wonderful experience. In between, we were in Europe, of course, at home in Denmark, and lived 6 months in Spain off and on, and it was a vagabond life. And then after that we moved to San Miguel Allende in Mexico for 2 years.
Wonderful place.
Wonderful place, and so many people here in Santa Fe are fortunate enough to go back. I don't go back anymore. I used to go back for a very long time, and since 2004 I haven't been back. And then we ended up in Santa Fe, and I worked for the state legislature for 5 years. And again, Carleen, that was another of these awesome experiences. I was a relatively new citizen, but working here in the legislative, the 5 sessions in the minority leader's office, I was told constantly by Hoyt Patterson, who was minority leader for years and years and years in the House, this is democracy in action. And it truly is, because everybody came up during the session from the state and hoped to meet their representative, and invariably they were received with open arms. They were listened to. Whether they were successful or not, that is another story. Sure. But it was the open door policy. And for me, it was sort of an amazing experience, because while we were in Washington, while I was in Washington when we first came, of course we went through the horrendous assassination of John F. Kennedy.
Yes.
And I remember my little brother and my parents and I, we were kind of looking at each other saying, it's not done. You don't do this. You don't assassinate people,
right.
Not in this country. And then when they left, I remember in 1968, Martin Luther King, I was at the Ford Theater, Washington erupted. And then a few months later, I shall never forget, Carleen, I had been at an embassy dance. I still remember the dress I had on. I remember what I did. I came back to my flat, I put on the radio, and I heard about Robert Kennedy. And I had my papers for citizenship ready to be filed on my desk, and I tore them up. I wasn't about to have anything to do anymore with this violent country. And it took me a year. You know, you have the legal pad, you have positive, negative, you put it on, to know that I would love to stay, but I have always maintained that I was baptized by fire as an American citizen.
That first impression was nothing.
I was here 6 years, and then I became a citizen, and I have never forgotten that. Also, it has sort of shaped so much of what you think about situations and how you deal with them and so on. And but on the positive side, I don't look back, and I love this country, and I hope to God we see it through the next few years with all this craziness going on. And it is something that I don't understand at all. But
very difficult, very difficult.
It is very difficult.
And that's why it's President's Day today. We have the flag up.
Absolutely.
And they'll have to walk over me to get to that flag.
I will help you. They'll have to walk over me too. Yeah.
We've dedicated this show to our past presidents who protected our democracy. They didn't always think right. They made mistakes, but our democracy was always protected, Absolutely. Even at the worst of things.
And you know what I found, because after my friendly divorce here in Santa Fe, and I'm a very good friend with my dear first husband, I returned to Washington and I worked for Pete Benedicte for 7 years.
Another New Mexican.
Yes, and the big difference between then and now was that back then everybody talked to each other.
Yes.
Their children went to the same school. They didn't dash back home and had lots of homes back home and left the family behind them, which happened later when Newt Gingrich, Speaker of the House, shortened the work week and therefore families stayed behind. But in those days, Pete Benedicte lived out in Rockville, had a very long drive into work every day, but his children went to school out there, and there were other senators and congressmen who lived out there, and so they mingled on the weekend and they talked to each other, and some of his dearest friends were Democrats.
That's right.
And that's how you work in politics. You work across the aisle, you compromise. I saw it also in the state legislature here, that people talk to each other, for God's sake. I mean, you are allowed to think differently, but it's the way, I think, you present your case, and you don't yell and scream. You talk like reasonable people about it.
That's right.
It's just, I'm so glad I'm out of all of that. I couldn't stand it. I
Yes.
end up hitting somebody on the head, and that is not
Well,
good.
it's gotten to that point,
It
you
has
know,
gone,
that
yeah.
it could get really rough. No, it's compromise and negotiation. I worked, you know, some of the time over at the legislature here to get bills passed through. I worked for the highway department, and at that time, you know, I was on the PERA board, so we'd go over and, well, maybe we wanted to push something through the legislature. I talked to all of them. I didn't care if they were Republicans or Democrats or green-eyed monsters from space. I would work with them, and we got a lot of things passed that way.
Yeah, well done.
I know what you're saying.
Yeah.
Now, you get to Washington, D.C. How in the world did you ever get to be the grande dame?
The chatelaine.
Yeah, of Chatelaine,
Blair.
yes, of Blair House.
I think it was timing, luck, and that open door that I always maintain is there if something else bad happens. The open door somehow, one door closes, another one opens. But it hadn't I was in Peter Benedicte's office, and the phone rang I was at home, phone rang at midnight. And that was a dear friend of mine, Neb Brashik, who headed up the US aid effort in Belize at the time. And he said his wife would not forgive him if he hadn't talked to me before he dashed back to Belize again. And I said to him, Neb, I am so bored now. I have been 7 years now on staff in the Senate. And essentially I compared to designing a car. I was asked by the senator to do certain things in his communication division to design that. So it is like designing a car and building the car and test driving the car and making it work, and in the end it's all maintenance. You know what I mean? And this is sort of where I was at that time. I was coasting along, not really feeling challenges anymore. And he said, oh, you should go and see a friend of mine at State Department. And he arranged a meeting with the personnel director at State Department. And after he had listened to me for a little bit, he said, you belong in protocol office. And I said, fine, sounds good to me, you know. And then he called the executive director of the protocol office. And when he heard of my hotel experience and my 5, 6 languages, he said, oh my God, Blair House. Because Blair House had been closed for most of Ronald Reagan's presidency. And it was going to open in about 6 months. It had been closed for renovation and additional building, and all kinds of things had happened. And it happened, the final straw came when the chandelier fell into the bed of the King of Morocco. So you can imagine that sent a very strong message to the powers that be, better close down the house and do something about it. And then, of course, Congress appropriated money, and they created a Blair House Restoration Fund by private people who gathered pots of money to come in, which was wonderful, and reupholstered stuff and repaired walls and things like that. And so they needed a new manager, and I sort of happened to fall into that role. And
you
I
had the experience.
I had a couple of interviews, and I was even sent over to Ronald Reagan's very charming personnel director, and we had a long talk about photography and traveling before we even got around to the ideology of the whole thing. Was I a good Republican? And I was actually at that time, because the Republican Party stood for fiscal conservatism and social conscience, and that was a Danish thing
very,
as well.
Very,
you know?
very much the way the Danish
was,
people are.
Yes, yes. So I kind of ended up there, and I had 5 weeks to get things together, to put out stuff. Everything, when it was packed up, had been put in boxes that were then brought back from storage. Fortunately, there were 1 or 2 people still who remembered what went where, and so the laundress was still there, and she knew exactly what belonged where, and so on. And then there was a curator who was not helpful, and so I had to sort of fiddle a little bit myself with what do you put out, and what belongs in the behind glass doors and things like that. But it all worked out, and we were ready. And Ronald Reagan came and opened the house, and he was my first president.
Now Ronald Reagan
Yeah.
He was, I like the way you started this book, kind of like a Shakespearean event.
Well, it was in a way.
And you talk about the cast. You
Yeah.
said on one time you had some of the Shakespeare quotes in there about, you know, we're just travelers in this world, basically. You know, we go through the world, we come in and then we go out, and that's the same way Washington is. They come in and they go out.
Yeah.
It's located right across the street from the White House,
No,
isn't it?
it's kitty corner.
Okay.
It's across from the West Wing.
West Wing.
Yes, and because right across from the White House is Lafayette Park.
Okay.
And then we are the next, we start the next block. And we run, there's still the Renwick Gallery at the end of that block, and otherwise it's all Blair House. And Blair House, when I came in, was the largest it will ever be, I think, 70,000 square feet. And it's actually larger than the White House itself, which is really amazing. That building, it's larger than that, and it consists of 4 buildings, all national history, old history buildings, and there is so much history, American history, in the houses.
Absolutely.
And that is what made it. They were not. They were homes. When people came, they came to a home with cozy sofas, with fireplace, with candlelight, with flowers. There were many. We had 5 dining rooms, for instance,
Yes.
which was just as well, because when Benazir Bhutto of Pakistan came, they split up in 5 groups and they couldn't eat together, and the wife of the chief of protocol couldn't eat with the security guards. And so, of course, being Blair House, no problem, we take care of it, and we did. And so we would set special tables in certain rooms, and the whole, how can I explain it, the president's guest house. People say, why does he need a guest house and so on. Of course he does.
Absolutely.
Of course he does. Whenever the US president travels around the world, he is treated royally.
Yes.
I mean,
By England.
people,
England is just
yes, but when I think of the smaller nations, when they visit, they probably go into debt just to accommodate the splendor that they want to show the American president. And so we do need a guest house. And the reason the guest house in a way came about, may I tell
sure,
that story?
absolutely.
Was back in FDR's time, in his shortly after Pearl Harbor, the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 in December. Mrs. Roosevelt's least favorite guest was at the White House, and she encountered him at 6 o'clock in the morning. in his dressing gown, brandy glass in one hand, cigar in the other. And she said, "Mr. Churchill, what are you doing here at this hour?" She said, "Oh, I must see the president right away." And she said, "No, you parted from my husband 3 hours ago, and he needs his sleep, so you go back to bed, Mr. Churchill." And we at Blair House just know that was the drop that made the water flow over the glass, and she had had it up to her eyeballs with visitors at the White House, and they needed to find a guest house. And Blair House was a natural, because it was sold by the Blair family, and so the government bought it to use it for a guest house. And shortly afterwards, the Lee House next door also came on the market, and they could join up the two. And those two buildings consisted the White House until consisted of the guest house. And then in the 70s they needed much more space, and the two Jackson Place houses came on the market, and that was a natural connection of Blair House, so that it now faces Pennsylvania Avenue, it faces Lafayette Square, and the White House is over there, and it couldn't be better.
Yeah, very few people really know anything about it. And when I read your book, I said, my God, this is like a cabinet position.
Well, no, they didn't count it like that.
Well, I see it differently. These are the first people that meet Americans. When they come through that door, they're meeting you, they're meeting staff, they're meeting everybody.
Yeah.
And that's their first connection with American people.
Next, just after Secret Service.
Oh, the Secret Service,
and possibly a chief of protocol or visits officers who go out to the airport to receive them. Very often it's the chief of protocol who then flies in with them on the helicopter. There are two helicopters that pick up the visiting leader in Andrews Air Force Base usually, and they will fly in with helicopters and land at Washington Memorial. That's a pretty nifty place to land if you come to Washington for the first time, you know. And then the cars are there to freight them up to Blair House, and then usually they are delivered to me. And it was so interesting when I first came to Blair House to see the staff that was being gathered to serve the president and his guest. And they came from all professions: housekeeping, head butler, maître d'. Jose Fuster was from Spain and was the head butler on town. He was freelance and had worked for the chief of protocol, who said, "Jose, I want you at Blair House." He was wonderful. We had an executive chef from one of the hotels who came highly recommended. We had other people who had been trained in service-oriented jobs, and to get them together and to try to create a whole, because we all needed to trust each other, you know, you can't. I took them through the entire house, and we all trained in how to make a bed. We all trained in how to wash up. We all trained in all of these little things you have to do.
Setting tables.
Laying tables, of course, and serving. Because I said, what happens if one of us gets sick? Our staff was only 13 people. And although you can hire additional people, they have to be they have to be absolutely under security. They have to be checked for their background and so on. So it's a lengthy process. And I knew in the beginning we would have to do a lot of that ourselves. And it was so wonderful to see how a staff can come together and to live up to what's expected of them. And we came up with what is the mission of Blair House. And we all knew that what is said at the White House, we have nothing to do with that. We have nothing to do with the policy of what's going on. That's not our function, but we must give them a fantastic good dinner. We must give them a good night's sleep. We must have hot water that runs. We must take all those little worries away. We press their clothes. We send it out to dry cleaning. We wash it. We look after every little thing that they might need, because our mission is to send them over to the White House ready for whatever our president needs to discuss with them. And I think we succeeded. And the most important thing, of course, was that through our hospitality, never saying no, whatever they wanted, we would find a way. Yes. Putting soles on shoes, we sent them out to the shoemaker, we pick them up, we pay for it, it's part of the service. And we want all of those people to return to their villages around the world and say, America is wonderful. And that was our mission. And I do think that it's still the mission there. And because the house does something to you, it's such a responsibility.
Sure.
We are caring for an antique collection, for 4 old houses plus the addition, for the well-being of visitors and so on. It's a big responsibility, and each staff member has that responsibility to carry out.
So when say the Queen would come in, Queen of England, I know she was one of your guests, they have to have security, and they had to have a lot of security back then because of the Irish, you know.
But I will tell you, the interesting thing was that when the Europeans came, and that includes the Queen, their security was minimal. They traveled with maybe 1 or 2 security officers, while when our US president travels, he has 20 people around him.
Yes.
And there's something a little wrong with this picture. But the Queen, what was so interesting about her, and of course the other visitors, there is always advance visits. And that her staff came over from Buckingham Palace, and her private secretary, her assistant, her number 2 private secretary, was an old friend of mine from my early days in Washington. So it was so easy to deal with him, and he told me exactly what he wanted, how the chairs should be, what kind of meals he would have. Everything he laid out for me, and I just followed what he wanted. Yes. And it made it so easy. And what was so much fun in a way about that visit was he had also asked me on one of his first visits if I could give him some notes about our visit in Washington of President Wałęsa of Poland.
Yes.
Because the President Wałęsa was going to be at Buckingham Palace and at Windsor Castle in between my friend's advance visit and the Queen coming to Blair House. So it would be useful if I could tell him what happened. We would first have that visit, then the Queen would have the visit, and then she would come to Blair House. So I made a handwritten note. I didn't have time for anything, and I said they were so lovely, and this is don't go to the chief of protocol, he is hopeless, but go to this person who is excellent, and they eat a lot, I said. We cooked for three extra. If there were 50 people in the house, we cooked for 150, for instance. And so when the Queen came in, my friend had come just ahead and said, "I'm very sorry, your notes went straight up to her." And so she commented on it and told me, yes, they do eat a
and she
lot.
has a good sense of humor.
She had a wonderful sense of humor. But I will say that what struck me with her, we of course stay out of the way. You're never around unless they ask for you.
Yes.
But what struck me about her was how she was on time all the time. She was the first one down in the morning practically. And I noticed how she would stand and just wait, and as if she was completely resting in herself, gathering strength for the next event. And there were many, it was, you know, back to back the whole time. And that struck me as amazing and so admirable.
And she was so well trained.
She not
From
only
the
well
time she
trained,
was a
but you
child.
know, a lot of people are trained, but they kind of take it elsewhere. But she was just, it was her duty. And the fact that for how many years, 64 years,
Oh, yeah.
she could carry out that duty and still be so dignified and together and sort of resting in herself, that was quite remarkable,
Yes,
I thought. Yeah.
she was a remarkable woman.
Yeah.
One of the funny things that happened, tell me about the Russian president.
No, Boris Yeltsin was the first.
Boris Yeltsin.
Boris Yeltsin, I never met Gorbachev because I came in after he
Sure.
sort of, yeah. Boris Yeltsin came. He was wonderful.
I know, everybody loved him.
He was big and booming and smiling and thrilled. And I mean, after all, it was quite a miracle what had happened. You know, there he sat on the tank in Moscow and survived that and made all the right decisions at the time and truly tried to break down all these barriers. I'm so sad he did succeed. But he was just wonderful and kissing everybody. And I remember he came twice, and the first time was President Bush invited him, and that was the time when Secret Service were scared to death because he insisted on walking among people. That was the way he was, and would shake hands and kiss women and be big and boisterous and so on. He was wonderful. Now, the second time he came, he had been quite ill, I think, and we had this incident where at night, at 1 o'clock in the morning, sadly, I had just gone up to bed. I always regret it, but our security picked up on their screen the Honorable President of the Russian Federation clad in the tiniest bikini pants coming down a back stairs from his suite. I believe he took a wrong turn. Instead of going to the bathroom, he took a turn and came down this staircase, quite a dangerous staircase, which is never used. And they were sitting there with their eyes open, and suddenly he appeared out in the basement, and and our people, diplomatic security, called Secret Service and said, "My God, you have to do something. Your man is loose in the house." So they caught up with him, and they caught up with him, I believe, in the living room where he was standing, and he literally was half naked, you know. And they were trying to get him back to bed and so on. And it was quite a night. It was quite a night.
Yes, and he probably had a good humor about the whole thing himself.
Well, I don't even know if he remembered, because he was dead drunk. And at the table they had, it was just the first evening he was there, at the dining room table they had brought in their own vodka, although we would supply whatever they needed. And apparently there was some heavy drinking, and nobody sort of kept an eye on him, which was not so good. But anyway, he the next day over at the White House, and this was in the Clinton years. Mr. Clinton had the second visit of him. I still remember them standing on the podium in strong sunshine, and they were having the official welcome, where all our samples of all our different services marched by, and there's lovely music and so on. And he was standing there with the eyes going madly, and we picked it up on television at Blair House. and somebody said, "Oh, the poor man! Nobody told him to have sunglasses on." And my assistant manager and I looked at each other because we knew he had the mother of all hangovers. But he was charming.
Everybody liked him, I know.
Yes, yeah, he was lovely.
And I think he liked the United States too.
I think he did, and he admired things, but there were so many things I always found the Russians didn't quite understand. If you had grown up in a communist country, you have been deprived of a lot of stuff, and I could see that. And but it was an interesting experience, and even when you have people you don't care for, you do the best you can. You have to. You cannot have feelings or emotions. You can just be diplomatic.
Yes.
You know, that's the whole thing.
Now, Ronald Reagan was very affable, I think.
Very affable, but I only met him once. And I was a little shocked because, don't forget, this was the beginning of my own tenure there. At the advanced team, how they went about it, they counted each step he would take from where he came in, literally, and wrote it down. The riser on which he had to get up to welcome all the people who had funded the restoration could only be of a certain height. And I thought this was ridiculous. I didn't understand it. But then later, of course, when he revealed this horrible disease, it became totally clear to me that that was the way they could make him function properly. This old actor was used to learning everything by heart, you know, and therefore they could say, you have 5 steps to that. This is where you sign the guest book. You turn around, you walk 10 steps that way, then you turn left. I mean, it made sense to me. He was smiling, he was lovely, but
it was starting to affect
But Nancy Reagan was lovely. She was much maligned, I think, with much of what she did. She came many times over just to have lunch with somebody, and she loved Blair House, and she was always perfectly lovely.
She was basically, for a while there, she was the president.
Probably.
She was very protective of him.
And what do you think goes on now? That we don't want to talk about that.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Now, he had, of course, George Bush.
I call him Papa Bush with great affection.
Yes, and he had James Baker and Lawrence Eagleburger and Reed, and they all had chiefs of protocol. A lot of people don't know that.
No, but the chief of protocol comes from the president.
Okay.
Works for the president, and that has to do with making sure that the ceremonies are in order and that people are treated properly, and the cars are lined up the correct way, and they arrive in their destination at the right time. It's a very important function, because otherwise people will walk in and not know what they are supposed to do. And you can't have that when you are on a schedule like that.
It has to be perfection.
It has to be, yeah.
One of the characters in your book that served with Ronald Reagan was Selwa Lucky Roosevelt.
Oh, but she hired me.
I was going to ask you, tell me a little bit about her.
She was the chief of protocol, and she was the widow, I did meet him, of the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, Archie. Absolutely lovely man. And she was also a journalist, and although Republican had written a lot about women's issues and supporting women's issues and so on, and Ronald Reagan asked her to be chief of protocol.
Yeah.
And she said, but you must realize that I haven't exactly been along what you have talked about. he said, no problem, I would like you to be my chief of protocol. And she knew everybody, and she knew how to behave, and she knew how to do things and so on. And she is the one who sort of hired me, I had to go and have an interview with her, and told her about my background, and then she gathered her staff the second interview to find out if there were any hang-ups from them, and then she offered me the job.
Under President Bush, George
Yes.
H.W., he was married to Barbara.
He was married to Barbara,
Now,
yes.
Barbara was a feminist all the way.
She was fabulous. I liked her so much. I know she has had a lot of flack, and everybody gets criticized, of course, when they're out in public life. But what I liked so much about her was she looked you straight in the eye. And she asked me questions. I was allowed to answer. I could give suggestions. She said, this is what I need. She came and walked through the house before they moved in. It is tradition at Blair House, or rather the tradition of a president-elect, that they stay at Blair House before they go to church and then to the White House and then go up and get sworn in. And they can have the use of the house subject to the sitting president's own use of the house when they come to do transition business. So we had, Carter apparently came 5 times and stayed for 5 days, you know, at a time. President and George and Barbara Bush only came the few days before the inauguration because they already had a perfectly good house up on Massachusetts Avenue in the vice president's residence. So we only had them for a few days. But they were lovely. And what, perhaps I hope I have it in the book, I can't remember, but when when the first afternoon they were at the house, Mrs. Bush asked everybody to come out and sit on the risers that had been put up because we feed the entire diplomatic corps after the swearing in. They come down after watching that, and then we feed them at Blair House, and then they sit outside looking at the parade. So all of that was ready, and she had her family out sitting on, and it's a big family, sitting out on these benches to watch George Bush come over from his office at the West Wing. And in the middle of this, suddenly little Jeb Bush dashes out, 5 years old, has a big conference with his grandfather in the middle of Pennsylvania Avenue, and the soon-to-be most powerful man in the world sits down on Pennsylvania Avenue tending to serious business, that of tying the shoelaces on a little boy. Yeah. And for me, that was one of the most telling times for what made Papa Bush function, which was the love of family, down to earth.
Didn't she
was
tell you at
she was wonderful.
One point when somebody said, well, you know, can we do anything for you? And she, oh, don't worry about it. She says, back in Kennebunkport, all of them come in. I just take a hose and hose everything down.
She also,
and that sounds like something she'd say.
She also said that to me when she was so worried about where her naughty grandchildren were going to eat. And I said, please, Mrs. Bush, we think perhaps they would like to eat here, and we can make this into a big playroom with television and a computer and all of that. And we used the new garden room for that. And she said, oh, good. And then when they have eaten, you just hose down the table like I do at Kennebunkport. And she was so great. And what was so wonderful about her, every time we had a visit, she would turn up. And she would turn up and take the spouse on a program around Washington. And she always checked with that spouse Are you being looked after at Blair House? Is there anything wrong? Do we need to know whatever it is? And I usually got feedback that she had been asking about me. So, but I apparently passed muster. So
You got past the test. Okay, then along comes a whole new generation.
A whole new,
Brand new young people.
Yes.
Bill Clinton and Hillary.
Yes.
Now, Bill Clinton was brilliant. And Hillary was brilliant too, both of them.
Yeah.
But he was more
relaxed, yeah.
you know, relaxed, funny.
Yeah,
But she was pretty serious.
Yeah, she was, I think he was very serious too, but he just had less discipline perhaps than she did. He was never on time. And of course that was one of the things that were drummed into us by Ambassador Roosevelt. You must never make them late for the White House, you know, but it was the other way around, that our poor visitor would have to wait because President Clinton wasn't ready for him. But you know what? I worked it out that Bill Clinton was so interested in everything. He had a mind that was unbelievable. He could absorb everything. And I think that if he was in conversation with people in the Oval Office, he couldn't just stop because somebody else was going to come. He had to finish this conversation. And so I thought, let him. This is what makes the man that, and that was a very big contrast to George W., who could switch it off just like that because now it was the time. And I don't know if he lost interest or what he did. I didn't know him that well. But with Clinton, it was a different thing. And with Mrs. Clinton, she was much more disciplined and in a way tougher. But what is so characteristic about her is that her staff adored her, would do anything for her. That's very telling. And the other thing, if I may, what I found about the Clintons, and they made me a Democrat, was what I loved about them and admired about them was that for them, everybody had value. It didn't matter where you came from, what creed you were, color, religion, if you walked on hands, if you had funny hair, if you had things coming out everywhere, you had value. And then, of course, if you prove that you don't have value, it's a different stuff. But you immediately, they had open arms. They were ready to how can I say it? To not judge you on who you were or what you looked like, but what you said and so on. And it was a wonderful experience for me. I loved those 8 years.
I think that Hillary was lambasted way too much. You know, she was a Satan worshipper. She ate babies in a Pizza Hut. I mean, and people believed it, of course.
Of course, yeah.
But Hillary really was quite a nice person, and very, you can connect with her.
Absolutely. Lovely person and fantastic. Think of her career, what she went, what she did.
Everything.
Yeah. She was awesome, I think, and I think also what he does now, helping people all over the world, is absolutely wonderful.
Just like Jimmy Carter.
Just like Jimmy Carter,
Yeah.
and yet, what are the others doing? You know, well, I don't want to get into. Don't get me started.
Stirring it up. Okay, let's go to Little George now.
And Little George
W.
I call him.
And Laura.
Well, yeah. And he, well, very affable, very nice.
Yes.
You know, I can see how he could have made it, you know, slapping people on the back and hugging them.
He was a good old boy.
But his people were so arrogant, I found. And they because we, and not only in Protocol Office, but everywhere else, had worked for Bill Clinton, we were scum, you know, we were and which is not the right way to do it, because you need government people, for God's
Absolutely.
sake. And it's all supposedly apolitical, so it doesn't make sense. And so they were very arrogant and nasty and unsmiling, and it was not a happy time for me. But I would say that George W., nowadays, of course, we all wish he was back, but that is a different story.
Yeah.
But she was lovely, very relaxed, relaxed to the point where she would walk down on bare feet in a dressing gown in the morning to have her first cup of coffee. So that was how relaxed she was, and that was fine. It was her house while she stayed with us, and they set the tone, and they could do what they wanted to. But there was, I had been increasingly upset about how that whole place was, that when I went over to a meeting about visits in the White House, the way the people, not George W., of course he wasn't there, but his people talked about the way the Clintons had arranged the visits and entertained them beautifully. They expanded the state dinners to maybe a couple of hundred people, had them under tents outside. I was invited to one of them with my then husband, my late husband now, an Australian naval officer, and we were invited to one of these. It was beautiful, lovely music, delightful food. The President, Mrs. Clinton, would visit each table, make everybody feel wonderful. That was criticized. Like it was torn to shreds in this meeting, and I came back to Blair House and I said, this is it. I can't be bothered anymore. I had my 20 years in the government, and I wasn't about to deal with it anymore because it was nasty. Yeah. And so I put in my resignation and I left at the end of July that year.
You mentioned something, and I didn't quite understand it in the book. President Mitterrand.
Yes.
And you referred to her as Madame.
Madame.
Mitterrand.
Madame, yeah.
Were you?
Madame, the French.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, she was...
Was she difficult?
Oh, both of them. My God, I was, in my innocence, I was showing the advance team from the French embassy, and that had come over from the president. He was my first real visit in my new job, one of the last of Ronald Reagan's. And in my innocence, I showed them the principal suite, the advance team. Oh my God, they can't stay in the same suite. They haven't talked for years. They hate each other.
Oh, they don't get along.
I was told they hate each other. I thought, well, this is a little more up close and personal than I had expected. But what we did, then I suggested perhaps Madame Mitterrand would like to stay in the foreign minister suite, because it's up on the next floor and over in another building. That was perfect. And so they arranged that, and it was so interesting to see, because they did have to be together in the same limousine going to the White House. And fortunately, they had one of their daughters with them, and she was put in the middle.
She put in the middle.
Weren't sitting together. But that was the way
well,
it was.
When you're around people like you were, you see everything.
I sort of see
the way they act, the way they relate to people, and
I
all
will
that sort of
say
thing.
that I had my file that I had in a drawer, and I would write my notes in Danish afterwards, because then nobody hopefully could read Danish, and they wouldn't know what I was saying about the people. And that's how I based my book on.
You based your book on that. Well,
yeah.
it's a very good book. Can people get that online?
Yeah, yes, but I prefer, if they want to go down to Collected Works and get it from Dorothy Massey. She is the most wonderful support in the town for all authors.
Okay.
And if they want to get it, otherwise, yes, you can get it online, and you can get it in ebook online on Amazon.
Okay.
But the more beautiful copy is the one that Dorothy has.
All right, at Collected Works.
At Collected Works, yeah.
Okay, now you're getting ready, you're writing another book now.
Yes.
Called My Life and Adventures. Well, you've had a heck of a life.
With hawks, hounds, and
houses.
houses. That's the important part. The hawks, the falcon, I lived with falcons for 11 years. I have had wire-haired dachshunds since the trip to Iran. I have little number 8 and number 9 now, and I have to survive them because they're only 6 and 9, so we have an agreement. And the houses, of course, I have lived in strange places around the world, and so that's what the story is based on. And it's not sort of a boring story with one page after the other, I did this, I did that. It's lots of anecdotes and introducing other people who are very interesting. For instance, in the new book that hasn't come out yet, I write about Admiral Flucky. And Admiral Flucky is, well, but just I want to tell you this. Admiral Flucky was in charge of all the military attaches in Washington from the Pentagon. And that's how I met him, and we became friends, and my parents knew him, and delightful man. And Admiral Flucky was in the Navy and in submarine, and in the Second World War, he did devastating work up and down the coast of Japan and that whole coastline. And there was one story about him where he had seen lots of Japanese warships in a very big harbor. So he dived down and he went into the harbor in his submarine and he mined them all. And came up, saw, golly, he had missed one. So he went back in again. And that was typical this man, and he got the medal of, the highest medal of honor that you can get. Absolutely wonderful. So I put anecdotes about sort of
what
famous,
yes.
And also in the book is James Hamilton, James Cameron with the Titanic.
With the Titanic, yes.
Because I became a member of the Explorers Club because of what we did in Iran, and I met James Cameron there, and I have a story about him where he has been down 11 or 12 times, where nobody else has been under the sea. It's absolutely amazing, and that has been the greatest pleasure.
If you were to make a guess, how many people did you, during your time at Blair House, how many people from kings, queens, dukes, prime ministers, presidents,
I think,
how many do you think? Give me a rough
I would
guess.
say we pretty much had, what can I say, I had 200 visits, and some of them were repeat visits.
Okay.
So maybe let's bring it down to 100 and some of leaders in the world. And then you have all the others who would come who didn't necessarily stay in the house, but they were entertained by our cabinet secretaries who were allowed to ask for the use of Blair House for dinner or lunch or meetings if the president did not need it at the time. And there they entertained their counterpart abroad. For instance, defense ministers came and were entertained by our defense minister. And the same would happen, that they had maybe a prince who would become the next king or something like that. The King of Spain, for instance.
Yeah, Juan Carlos.
Oh, he was there.
He was here in Santa Fe too.
He was, yes, lovely man.
Yes,
they are actually, the Spanish are lovely.
Yes.
Juan Carlos was one of my favorites. Juan Carlos of Spain, the King of Spain. He was lovely, and. Greece, we had King of Greece, we had all these people, and there were very few. It was really only Mitterrand who
He was very impressed with himself.
Who was impressed with himself. And the others somehow became human, I think, because they were in a home and they were surrounded with
luxurious.
Well, but also with warmth and kindness,
Yes.
and anything they wanted, they were left alone. We had President Clinton when the airplane, wasn't there an airplane that flew into the window or something like that at the White House, stayed at Blair House, asked if they could come over. And also when they had some work done and they had come back from vacation and their bedroom was not ready, they moved into Blair House. And I do believe, and they told me they loved it because they were not surrounded by people from everywhere. They were private, they had their daughter there, she had her own friends, they could see people, they didn't have any formality, and they loved that. And he would quite often drop over with Al Gore, and they might join a meeting that was going on, somebody had invited them to, and I would find them several times in the vault, in the pantry, where they were conferring about what to say next and what to do, while my staff was just working around them, washing up and polishing silver, and they were just standing there talking. And it was a lovely time for me, those 8 years. I really loved it.
Well, Benedicte, I want to thank you for being on our show today. You are indeed a wonderful ambassador for this country, and I'm glad you were an immigrant and you got here.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm so honored to be here, and I love this state. I love this city, and it's in my heart.
It's a wonderful
heart.
place.
Thank you.
Benedicte, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Colleen.
And thank you, Santa Fe, for tuning in today with my friend here who told us all about the Blair House and met more people than the president's ever probably met. Thank you so much for tuning in.